But I think she's in despair and she's flung herself down, and he doesn't know what to do to now communicate to her, and the kids are learning to cope.
Well, she's thinking,
how have I turned my head this much?
I don't have tantrums like that. What do you do now for your job?
That's a good question. I do a few different things. I advise some large companies, and I work with some venture capitalists who are looking to back people who are going to build small companies that will one day be large companies. And then I spend a lot of time thinking about where the world is going over the next 5, 10, 15 years, and I then turn that into writing or speeches in a way that I want to provoke, learn myself, shape that future if I can.
And does it feel like now is a time when those people that you're advising are more sensitive to the fact that there are big forces that are shifting the way that the world works?
Well, I think it's not just the people I advise. I can't remember a time where there has been so much up in the air. I lived through the social media bubble. I remember the dot-com bubble very clearly, the run-up of the internet from 1991 through to your dot-com adverts on every taxi and bus shelter and billboard in 1999 and 2000. Now that I can look back on that time and look at where we are today, I feel that the level of change is much, much more significant and much more fundamental than it was 20 years ago.
Is that partly because everything turned out all right and we're still here, though?
Well, I think it's because we're ready for the change. If you were an online retailer back in 1999, you had to build a lot of your own technologies yourself, and you probably had to get computers to your customers. Whereas today, everybody has a supercomputer in their pocket through a mobile phone. Most companies have spent 25 years becoming digital and connected to the internet. So it's just much easier to go out and effect the sort of scale of change that we're starting to see in the world today.
And we're here today to talk about the future of work and the changing role of jobs and work and technology. And why do you think that is such a hot topic? Why are we? Does it seem like, I'm sure when you got the email about this, you thought, future of work again.
Future of work again.
In Exponential View, your mail out it's in something about work is in so many of those editions. Why do you think it's such a hot topic?
Well, I think there are technological reasons for it, and there are also some more macro reasons. The technological reason is that about 5 or 6 years ago, there was some breakthroughs in a certain form of artificial intelligence. In other words, getting computers to do things that we normally associate with tasks that humans could do. And up until that point, 2011, 2012, 2013, computers had been bumping along with some of these tasks. That breakthrough opened up the potential to get computers into places where only humans had been. So that's one part of it. But the other part of it, I think, is to do with the result of the financial crisis, the global financial crisis, 2008, 2010, which has really constructed some fractures within a number of different economies. In the UK, we've had essentially stagnant living standards for the better part of a decade, and that's created some tension and some uncertainty. And those two themes have come together, and they're all really about what does the structure of the economy and the structure of the labour market look like over the next 10 to 20 years. Why not wrestle a python?
I like that they've called him an athlete, because in a time when surfing and skateboarding are being added to the Olympics,
I saw that, yeah.
This is the stuff we really need to see.
Python wrestling.
Python wrestling, alligator wrestling, all sorts of...
The thing is that we can now see it. In fact, just the day before yesterday, I saw a YouTube video of 3 young kids who found a python around a dog. So they wanted to rescue this dog, and so you get this little video shot of the kids sort of pulling the python off. And by the way, it's tough. I don't fancy our athletes' chances very much. But the interesting thing there is there's nothing weird that happens in the world that can't be made visible to us within a matter of minutes.
And you share, as well as insights about work and technology and all those lovely things, you share some of my favourite videos on Twitter. Pachelbel's Cannon.
Oh, done by rubber chickens.
Done by rubber chickens
Yeah,
was one of my recent favourites.
Yeah, I do share a lot of stuff that relates to animals and animals being happy. I think it's quite important. It's deliberate. It's done deliberately. I think it's important that we rethink our relationship with animals, and it's easiest to start with, dogs and dolphins because we all feel quite good about them. But I do it. It's not. I'm not going to say it's political. That would be too grand a word. But I share them because they make me feel good. But I also think they will increasingly have people sit there and ask questions about what is our relationship with these living things that occupy the world with us.
That's the most meaningful dissection of the cat video that I've heard, I think.
Well, I looked at these and it did make me think a little bit of some of the discussions about future of work. The one we see on the left, which is a woman looking after a sort of older man, that talks to the social care question. Social care is one of the jobs that is often thought to be the thing that robots will never come in and be able to do because it's so uncertain and there's a lot of dexterity required and it's going to change day to day. And the picture on the other side, which is a man looking very, very despondent in a smart suit,
happy.
Being consoled by his wife, in a sense speaks to the challenge of white-collar automation. What's happened in the workforce over the last 40 years is a lot of productivity gains have been made within factories. So you see that you need about a quarter as many people to manufacture $1 million worth of stuff today compared to 1980. People have said, well, offices are immune to this. And they have been immune to this because computers have been kind of slightly rubbish at automating the things that we do in offices. But increasingly, two things have happened. One is office work has become much more systematized, follows a process, and computers have got much better. So the second picture could be what is the possibility, the reality, the threat of white-collar automation?
Maybe that's his P45 in his hand.
It could be, but I mean, he might well actually be a gig worker by the time this happens, so he won't have a P45.
Well, let's talk about that then. So one of the other things that, when we talk about future of work, is there a difference between work and jobs? One idea might be that work is like a task that we need to be done, and a job, there's something more to that.
Yes, well, I think there is a difference, and I would say that a task is a task to be done. Work is probably more like a collection of tasks with some set of responsibility. I think we run a risk of focusing too much on the things that we grew up with and assuming there's a permanence about them. I mean, the idea of a job is, as we know it, which is that you work for an employer who directs you 50 weeks of the year to do what you need to do, is only 100 or so years old, 150 years old. The word job, J-O-B-B-E, only appeared in the English language in the mid-16th century. So we have to be quite clear about, at least from a technology perspective, what future of work starts to mean. It may mean that the nature of the employment relationship that you have is going to change. So you might become more of a freelancer or what we call a gig worker. It may also mean that the type of work, the tasks that you do in your day-to-day life are going to change. And those are two slightly different dynamics, but I think they're both occurring. And so when we look at what research tells us, what models tell us, and frankly, they're only as good as their best guess, it's that lots and lots of new jobs are going to be created. That is, bundles of tasks that need to be done regularly in developed countries because of productivity gains from automation. That's what technology has always done. It's raised the bar. It's meant that human cognitive and physical labor can go off to do something more valuable and still earn money. But within the context of the growth of those jobs, there are I mean, the World Economic Forum's estimate was 110 million new jobs in a few years. 75 million people whose jobs who will be displaced from their jobs. That is, the tasks they do within their jobs are going to significantly change enough that they'll need to go off and do something else.
Okay.
And so you can be a little bit, worried about the net, which is, 110 million is more than 75 million. That's a good thing. I think it's very important if we want to think about people's well-being and the well-being of their families, the well-being of their communities, frankly, their psychology, that we worry about the 75 million as well.
Well, sometimes it feels like the discussion is around protecting certain jobs. I mean, we're here in London, one common example is the cabbie, and with the rise of gig workers like Uber around the world, Lyft. Sometimes it seems that the conversation focuses a lot on protecting jobs and maybe doesn't discuss enough the people who could be taking the new jobs that could be caused as the result of disruption.
Yeah. Well, I think that is often the discussion, but it is also about vested interests. The cabbie is an easy one to identify and sort of maybe poke fun at or support. They're very visible in London, and one can say, well, I'd rather the Uber that's directed by GPS. But there are lots of other jobs that are protected professions. So anything that requires licensing, so becoming a general practitioner, a GP or a consultant, a doctor or a lawyer, these are all protected professions where, much as we don't want to admit it, they're going to put up exactly the same resistance that the cabbies did when there's any other type of innovation that comes along, whether it's technically driven or some kind of policy innovation. And I found it quite interesting when there was an AI company that had a little chat bot that claimed to diagnose your conditions. The way some doctors responded to that was not to say, look, here's a really powerful tool like a super stethoscope or a super X-ray machine that's going to make me do my job better. Many doctors responded, and through their organizations, saying, well, this is not what doctoring is about, and this is a bad thing, and this needs to be stopped. And it was a very odd response, but effectively it was a protected profession saying, we need to maintain the protections around our profession.
And people might feel differently if it's their doctor compared with someone who drives them from A to B.
Well, I think your question was a very pertinent one, which is should we think about the people who could come in to do the jobs who don't currently have jobs? And prior to having doctors, we had priests and witch doctors and leech appliers. It was
I saw a leech applier in one of the
painting, right? So I think the thing that we need to do is be a little bit open-minded about what this kind of innovation could mean. I spent a bit of time with an academic who looked at innovation in emerging markets. And what he tried to do was say, where do we see innovation in emerging markets that we can bring to developed markets? He looked at a couple of things in India, Aravind Eye Care and Narayana, I'm going to say this wrong, Narayana Hridalia, which was a cardiac care facility in India for children. They both had incredible volumes of sick patients going through with fantastic health outcomes. But what they didn't have was a Harley Street chained consultant. They had medical technicians who were really expert at suturing the ventricle or stitching the chest back up or cutting the chest open, supervised by doctors, because you couldn't afford to train all the doctors that you needed given the volumes of people. So there are methods of innovation that you can bring and say, how else would we cut this problem? And we have to recognize that any group that's in power is going to try to use its group power and its structural position where it can influence policymakers and it can influence the press and the market to say the way it's currently done, the power that we currently have, is the right way. And to some point, there's some truth in that, right? There's a kind of precautionary principle we want. We don't want to just go headlong into, crazy, unthinking innovation. But we also have to recognize that vested interests are just that. They are vested, and when we look at the challenges of innovation, they will generally push back on it.
What jobs have you had in the past?
Oh, my goodness,
Before you were advising companies about artificial intelligence and things like that?
I have had such a smorgasbord of jobs. I've generally done jobs that haven't existed the 3 or 4 years before I took them on.
Okay.
So my first job, I was at The Guardian, and while my job title, in a sense, was journalist or section editor, I actually also wrote the software for the first website so we put out, and was the website manager. This was in 1994.
Okay.
The web didn't exist in 1991.
But you were a website manager.
I was a website manager. And ditto when I went to The Economist, I was a journalist, but half my job was to run our website and run our email newsletter services. Would know email newsletter services 5 years earlier. And so all the jobs I have done have been really by accident rather than design, at this strange front end where I can't go and find someone and say, when you did this job 5 years ago, how did you solve this particular problem?
I was picking tomatoes when I was 17.
Were you?
Were you already at The Guardian? You're going to make me feel terrible.
I got to The Guardian at 21, I think. Yeah.
Well, I'd picked a lot of tomatoes by then.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I was just really lucky. I'd had 53 job rejections.
Oh, wow.
So leaving university, it should be very easy to get into the job market. You've got a degree, the university's got a career service. All the employers troop through your university and say, come and become an accountant. Mm-hmm. It'll be the life of your dreams. And everyone rejected me for everything. And eventually the local surfboarding magazine offered me a reception job, and The Guardian offered me...
The local surfboarding magazine?
I lived in Essex by the coast.
All right.
So there was down the road from my house, there was a magazine called Boards, which was the surfboarding magazine. They offered me a reception job, and The Guardian offered me a few days to help at an event and fix some modems. And I kind of got on with the team there, and then I just started to come into the office, and then after about 3 or 4 weeks, I was part of the furniture.
And you never looked back
didn't really look back.
At boards?
I mean, I've been on a surfboard since then, but it was on the ground. I stood on it.
Well, the Lady of Shalott's not on a surfboard. She's in a boat.
She's pretty famous, isn't she? Yeah.
She looks quite concerned. Maybe it's the leeches.
It could be the leeches, but the Lady of Shalott comes at a really interesting time, because I think there's a poem by Tennyson of the same name, and this was a moment where Britain was, in the 1880s, 1870s, really at the peak of its position in the global economy. It was just making the switch towards being an empire. It was the largest economy in the world. The Industrial Revolution had really been our friend. The textiles business, where we were getting our raw materials from the colonies, had made Britain incredibly wealthy. America hadn't yet picked up a lot of steam, but it was. And I think there was a lot of wistful dreaminess that came out of the poetry and the art of that period, from the end of the 18th century to the 19th century, in a sense because people were being, at that stage, stripped out of the countryside into the cities. The cities were not very nice. That period in the Industrial Revolution was a blip where working hours actually increased significantly. So the amount that people were working in the late 19th century and the conditions under which labour toiled were substantially worse than they had been 100 or 200 years earlier. But the country was getting richer and richer. So after hundreds of years of sort of, not much happening in terms of productivity and GDP, there's been this uptick. And it's the backdrop from which, Marx and the labour movements arose. And so the poetry and the artistry of the time didn't reflect so strongly the toil within the cities. Mm-hmm. It's quite interesting because it's one of the things that I've started to try to understand in an attempt to understand where are we in the cycle of the information revolution and how long, what are the sorts of changes you might expect to see when there is a phase change in the structure of the economy, because this was the absolute, in a sense, this was the fastest growing point, delta of change in the Industrial Revolution that had started in the 1750s and the 1760s, and it's 100 years later.
We hear all the time about more and more people moving to cities, but is technology and the impact it will have on work, is it going to accelerate that? If you're a gig worker, you're probably going to get more gigs in a densely populated urban centre rather than out in the sticks.
Yes, well, I think the truth of cities is that cities are amazing places, and they are amazing places when we think about the financial cost and the environmental burden of meeting people's Maslowian hierarchy of needs, their food, their shelter, their clean water, their ability to meet and interact with people. For all of the kind of crime and filth in city, the environmental load of a typical city dweller is much lower than somebody who doesn't live in a city. So there are macro reasons why, from a policy perspective, it makes sense. But I think there are also reasons why there are many, many Dick Whittingtons coming into the big city, because once you get into a city, you're also exposed to many more ideas at a much faster rate, which is why you have disproportionate amount of innovation that comes out of cities. So I expect there to be a continuing urbanization of countries because of the natural superlinear returns to scale within cities. Now, could that create problems? I mean, I think that the city-rural divide has been one of the critical divides in politics, which I don't think we're going to spend too much time talking about.
I know what you're getting at.
But across, if you look at the various populist movements in Turkey and in Austria and in Hungary and in the UK and in the US, there was a very clear urban-rural divide, and so you have to figure out how you cross that. I don't think cities are attractive because of particular policies that they follow. I think they are attractive because actually some fundamental physics of networks, more people, more connections, more opportunity, better outcomes. And then these things that scale very well, effectively the environmental load. And as we start to think about moving to sort of sustainable forms of energy, so the solar switch and so on, and even things like vertical farms, high density farms, those things make sense in cities, and they make cities even better than they traditionally have been. So figuring out how we think about that and how we manage the fact that there are going to be people who are not going to be able or not going to want to move from sort of rural areas is quite an important one.
And you mentioned then about in cities all these concentration of flows of information, of stuff, and it creating opportunity. And one of the positive spins in a way on the gig economy is that it's opened up new opportunity for people to participate in the economy with a really low barrier to entry.
Yeah.
Another.
Can we talk about that?
Please do. Yeah,
because,
go on.
It so breaks the narrative.
And everyone seems to think but there's a real dark side to it. But is that?
Look, it breaks the narrative. There are lots of reasons why the gig economy creates opportunities and why it creates problems. And there's no question that the way that Uber for a while carried itself was not a particularly pleasant way for it or for us. The funny thing about the gig economy is that if you talk to Uber drivers, they're generally pretty satisfied. The Oxford Martin School recently came out with a study that was co-authored by some people from Uber, so some caveats there, but it was a very strong university school with some impeccable academics. And they looked at Uber drivers in London and they found a few things. They're really delighted. They're happy people. They're happier on average than Londoners. A vast majority of them change their working hours week to week. And most of them were working on average 30 hours. So what's wonderful is that even though Uber was launched by this by somebody who was quite a libertarian, where essentially cash is king, and it was homo economicus of the kind of horrible neoliberal economic consensus of the 70s. Uber drivers were trading off money for time. Their utility curves in economic speak were not just about the greenback. And what the research was saying was, we don't mind earning less because we have much more flexibility. We can live much more wholesome lives. We can be closer to the non-financial, non-work things that matter to being a whole person. So in all of the challenges of the gig economy, being more precarious, not having a pension, not knowing day to day, all the things that the unions rightly kind of question, there's also this other side, which is, you know what, I'm not going to do a 10-hour shift today because my mum's sick and I need to go and see her, or I'm going to stop at 3 because I've got to pick up the kids from school.
You've just summed up let's just go back to the piece you glossed over there.
Yeah.
Not having a, did you mention purpose?
Purpose.
Maybe a lack of purpose,
Yeah.
security around pensions and health insurance, things like that. Those are pretty big things themselves, aren't they? They might be things that you might immediately not value so much because you can change your hours week to week, but in a few years' time you might feel you might wish you'd made different decisions.
Well, and this is then therefore the miracle of the state, because the state has built, its taxation policies, its fiscal policies, its benefits policies on the basis of certain assumptions. And all the institutions that sit around that are market institutions, for example, mortgage lenders and insurance companies and health providers, are also based on that. So in the last few years, I moved from being a PAYE employee to I'm a gig worker, right? I work for a bunch of different people. And I discovered that actually I can't get the same mortgage because I don't have pay slips. Mm-hmm. And I'm paying, whatever, 0.25 percentage point more than I would otherwise. So what has to happen is those institutions have an opportunity to adjust. And there are lots of different ways they can do it. They can start to say, if you're a gig worker, we're going to make it much easier to manage your taxes. We're going to provide certain incentives for you to get unemployment and sickness insurance. I have unemployment insurance that I pay for myself, but I'm not sure how many gig workers do that. And those are things that where the state can start to step in. So there's a gap right now because our laws and the way the providers worked was set up based on lots of people being in employed work of a traditional sort. Well, if lots of people are going to move to gig work, then let's find those solutions. And we're starting to see it. We're starting to see entrepreneurs come out and say, well, we're now going to intermediate, so stand in between a gig worker and an insurance company so that the gig worker can get the insurance they need. One example is getting commercial insurance just for the time that you're driving your car as an Uber driver and not paying commercial rates when you're not using it, which saves you money straight away. So I'm optimistic that there are ways of solving the problem. I'm not optimistic that one can go off and take the tools and norms and institutions of 70s corporatism and get them to fit the model of gig work. But I think you can move those institutions along and innovate new ones which provide essentially the same sorts of things. I mean, ultimately, the government has now stepped in and said every employer has to provide pensions. That's only a step away from saying, well, every person who earns needs to have a pension in some way and then create a market for it.
Yeah. This is a favourite of yours, like you were saying beforehand.
This one up here, yeah. So what was this? This was a woman talking to her dad saying, the dad was a fisherman and for whatever reason, the ships have been automated away. So she's going through the list of
self-driving ship,
or no ships needed because of 3D printing and their inefficiency, and her going through the list of possible retraining options. And it's sort of, well, you can become a Reiki healer, or you can become a barber, or you could go into elder care.
I don't think you should become a barber.
No, I'm not sure. Well, cobbler's children. And I think what it captures for me is the blasé way with which retraining lists have been produced by research companies and consultancies, when what we actually have to think about is that for many people, change will be done to them. They won't have the lucky position to, watch a film like this or even, be in it. It will be transmitted to them through the mechanisms of the economy and their employer and their firm. Change will be done to them. It doesn't matter whether theoretically the work is less hard, less dangerous, more fun, more sunlight, better paid. Change is being done to you. And I think this is one of the areas where I feel a bit uncomfortable about whether we've really thought enough about it.
Is there much, these are all snapshots of history. Is there historical precedent for, everyone seems to mention the Luddites when we talk about technological changing work. Are there more or better examples than that? Is there anything we can learn? And specifically about this question of can the future of work really be shaped, and how?
Well, I think it can absolutely be shaped, and because the way in which we agree what we agree on is a process of consensus.
When you say we, do you mean?
We in society. It's all a set of collective fictions. Why do we include spending on defence in the calculations of gross domestic product? And yet, one could argue that that's not really productive, although it's important. What we chose to measure in things like GDP were things we chose to measure. They weren't real things. And it's a bit like saying, well, we're going to play bowling, but we're only going to count it as a legitimate ball if you knock down 5 pins or more. You'll score more than me as a result because you get all these other...
Bowling was actually another idea for today.
So look...
I like your rules.
Yeah, my rules are great. But the point is that we can absolutely change them because we can start to say what are the things that we think are important and the things that we think are less important, and we should start to measure them. And, even the questions of sustainability, it's absolutely egregious, for example, that despite knowing the costs of carbon to the environment, it's not priced into the use of that carbon. That's just a really silly situation for us to have got ourselves into. But we could change that if we wanted to. It's not like changing a law of physics. That's a much harder thing to do. This is absolutely manageable if we have the will to do it. And so I think when I think about the impacts on, from history, we have the advantage of knowing what that history looked like. And the Luddites, what did the Luddites ask for? The Luddites asked for sharing the upside of the automation.
And that's another one of the positive stories that that some optimists are saying about technological change is that that will happen again. The benefits of this increased productivity will be distributed among the people, among the rest of us.
No, they won't be. The benefits of the productivity without intervention will accrue to the companies who run the software and the most brilliant people within those companies.
20 people in an office in Silicon Valley.
Yes, but who will get outsized rewards. So there's this idea of the superstar company, which is the ones that we can think of, the Facebooks and the Googles and so on, who represent much of the accelerating productivity growth, profit growth, and market value, and they're pulling away from the pack. But if you look at the equality levels within those companies, they actually have quite unequal distributions because the very richest employees within those companies are doing very, very well. Even if Facebook's average salary is $240,000 a year globally, the very, very richest can look down on that tiny number from their heights. So I think without proper interventions, the productivity gains, yes, will be shared. We'll all have better phones. But that's as far as it'll go.
Are there long-term problems that, if we were revising a business now about the way that they were going to treat their workers, or if they were going to automate a bunch of jobs, are there long-term considerations they should be thinking about that could have negative impacts in the long run about doing that?
Well, I mean, all businesses should think longer term than they do, as the first starting point. But there's something interesting about automation so far, which is that automation within particularly offices in the UK, we're a service economy, so most people live in offices and not working down mines. There is automation happening in offices. The initial sales pitch from these automation vendors, they're called RPA, robotic process automation, is that you will have lots of headcount savings. In other words, your costs will come down because you'll be able to get rid of a lot of people. Turns out, in general, you're not able to do that, because while you automate all these tasks to the point that many jobs disappear, you have this other massive backlog of work that you've not been able to get to. And those humans know your business, they know the culture, they know the people around them, they know the detail, the minutiae, because they've been working on the minutiae, and they shift over to those pieces of work. So while there's a really rapid growth, and it's really significant in robotic process automation within offices, it's not yielding the headcount savings, the job losses that people assumed it would, but it is yielding significant improvements for the companies because people are going on to work that was otherwise not being done, which is quite interesting. I mean, that's an optimistic little scenario. What the trouble is, what the technologists say is that's only going to be short-lived, because at some point the RPA gets so good, there are no new jobs.
And that brings us to another optimist, Keynes, who said that by now we'd be all, what would be on, 15-hour work weeks, or that basically we'd be doing a lot less work and we'd have a lot of leisure time and we'd be all chilling out. Which
like this family here. This is amazing. This is a busy Wednesday in Keynes's future.
Exactly. And they're all just sitting around eating apples by the looks of it.
Yeah, apples.
It's a wedding.
Cake.
It's a wedding.
Is it a wedding?
It's a wedding.
Look. Yeah, look at that.
You just thought they were fancy dressed.
Well, so here's I've got some data from the US, talking to another economist, Jeff Sachs, a few months ago, and he observed to me that US gross domestic product per capita, which is the national income divided by the number of people, is about $55,000, $56,000, $57,000. The average American adult, if you take all the adults and you total up how many hours they work, and you divide them by the number of adults, works about 3 hours a day. So the average American adult is already on 21 hours of work a week. The problem is that it's not shared evenly. So there are lots of people who are on disability benefits in the US and don't come off it. There are lots of, particularly men over the age of 40, who are actually not in the workforce at all. And there's a bunch of people working 90 hours a week. So in some sense, we have got to that point where actually that $55,000 is being produced by the efforts of 3 hours of every adult per day, which is a pretty phenomenal thing if you think about it. But we haven't worked out how to allocate the resources and correct for all the income traps that emerge, particularly once you get onto some kind of welfare benefit.
If we did distribute that work more widely and we all saw an average lower amount of hours in our working week, how do you think we'd use that as a society? When people talk about basic income, they say, well, if people didn't have to go to work, they'd just do creative things like paint pictures and do crafts and things like that.
Yeah, it's a really, it's an interesting point. I'm not sure about basic income. I'm more clear about increasing level of services. That's what we've traditionally offered. We've pushed the school age. We offered various types of healthcare, and I can see that in a wealthier society we could offer more and more services that enable people to function in the economy. And once people start to function in the economy, we can they can figure out their own utility curve between pleasure and enjoyment, maximizing what they earn. I think one of the things that we've started to see is a return and an interest in artisan style products and provenance and conversation. And this is less to do with the immediacy of sort of whizzy AI technology. It's more to do with that period of massification that we went through that started with, in a way, the Henry Ford Model T car, but then drove its way across every industry and the advertising business that supported it, and then persuaded us that success looked like being a lot like the stuff that your neighbour had.
Keeping up with the Joneses.
Keeping up with the Joneses. And what we are starting to see is a shift towards more personalisation, more artisanship, more locality, which I think is quite interesting. Now, I can't figure out whether that's enough, but it does seem clear to me that there's a vast amount of stuff that we used to want to buy that we're going to stop buying. So the car is the obvious example. I mean, as somebody who, I use ride sharing and bikes and what have you a lot, and I'm involved in one autonomous vehicle company, self-driving cars. When I sometimes go to the cinema and see the car ads, I just feel like I'm walking back into the 1970s.
The whole image they try and sell you with the
so I'm not going to buy
the
a
open
car.
road.
I'm not going to drive a car. I don't enjoy driving a car. Why on earth would I tie up my capital like this? I've got so many other choices. And again, those things become enabled and then they become beliefs. And so you see a declining number of young people taking their driving test, which means that owning a car becomes even harder. You see families like mine where, we're not replacing our car at the rate that we might have done as a family 20 years ago or 25 years ago. So I think when we start to think about how does the economy change and how do people's behaviours change, there are lots of different factors come to play.
She's been peering over my head when we've been talking for the past few minutes. I'm surprised you managed to stay focused, because who have we got? Lady Macbeth. Ellen Terry as Lady Macbeth. It's quite imposing.
It is quite imposing. I didn't remember her crowning herself. Did she crown herself?
I don't remember that either.
Yeah. That is, I'm not sure what, yeah.
We've got Dieppe. I went through there a couple of years ago on the way to France for holiday, and it's changed a bit since 1890.
But what you can see there is there are no cars on that road. And I would imagine that more and more roads will start to look like that. And more cities will start to look like that, because people are healthier in cities without cars. They're healthier in cities and happier where they can cycle or walk. Technologies give us reasons to be more local. I mean, I think one of the funny notions of the internet, which has been this global village, was that it constructed the death of distance. I could work with you, you could be in Singapore and I could be in Santiago, and we could collaborate. And you'd do things that would be crazy. I mean, I remember making long distance phone calls and you'd be talking as fast as you could while you're shouting to the receiver. And now you run a video call with your mother long distance for 5 hours at a time so they can chat to their grandkids. We don't even think about that. But at the same time, technology enables people to be local. And one interesting thing that's happened in New York has been that the peak time traffic on the subway has really smoothed out. It's no longer is it a rush at 7 a.m. and a rush at 6 p.m. because there are many more freelancers and gig workers in New York because of the creative industries in particular, and people working in technology. So they can travel whenever they want at 10 a.m., 2 p.m. You know, they're not in that sort of Wall Street 9 to 5, Dolly Parton's 9 to 5. Not going to sing it.
Well, maybe after this, when the cameras will stop rolling, you'll give us a rendition. There's no point if the
cameras are not rolling.
I think I'd benefit from it.
And what's happening is that people can now, work where they are, maybe go into work 2 or 3 days a week and work from home and be in their local neighbourhood. And I think that trend will start to pick up. And it'll start to pick up because offices will also start to realise that it's not that useful bringing people in and bussing them in and bussing them out.
And then we've got all this office space that's going to be
turned into live-work units and artisanal butchers.
Great, I look forward to that. Maybe it's the low-skilled jobs that will be most at risk from being replaced by some sort of technological innovation. So that brings back to the idea about maybe around training or around education. Do you think there's things that we could be doing in the education sector now to better prepare people for an uncertain future when it comes to work?
Well, yes, we can definitely prepare people for an uncertain future. The way to do that would be to teach the skills of dealing with change and of learning to learn, kind of metacognition. That's been the thing that I've been lucky at. I've learned how to learn things, and that's why I can move and have moved into lots of jobs for which there's no playbook. But I don't think education deals, as we think about it, deals with what is coming down the track, because education is this amazing thing with a really long lead time. So my eldest child is 13, won't hit the workforce for basically the better part of a decade. So even if you could change the syllabuses today, it's not going to really impact you till 2029. So I think the real question is, what are the things that are going to hit us in 2020 to 2024? That's less about education, it's more about reskilling within the workplace. And how do you go about creating the right kind of environment that enables people to reskill. And there will be lots of objections as to why I shouldn't reskill and why I don't want to do it. I mean, I think we've had an opportunity in the UK that is not really an opportunity. When it's a really bad thing that you've got a chance to live through, is that but survive? Is that an opportunity?
Maybe not.
No, so it's the wrong word. But during the miners' strikes came in the mid '80s, and the employment within that particular industry declined 90+% over the course of a couple of years, and there was all sorts of sort of unhappiness and unpleasantness, frankly. But that shock that was delivered to those communities was done without a regeneration, reconstruction, personal security strategy in place. And those areas have taken a long time to regenerate, and they now, actually, in many cases have. But for a long time, there was worse health outcomes, in general, worse wellness outcomes that just echoed for decades after. So we have this sort of counterexample of how not to do it within the UK. And so as we start to think about these changes, automation is going to come. It's going to come because it's going to make sense, not just for rich Uncle rich Uncle Moneybags, the arch capitalist. It's also going to come because somebody runs a small business making windows, and they can now buy a £30,000 robot that will run for 5 years and will do the job of two of their workers. And that small business person is going to have their own mortgage, meet their own profitability, have to compete in the market, and so on. So I don't think there's any point arguing about whether the automation is a good or a bad thing. It's going to happen. It's going to come. It will, in some cases, in the very minimum, require people to change jobs, perhaps in the same organization, perhaps not. In many other cases, it will require them to reskill. And we will need to figure out how we deliver that vast amount of reskilling and who's going to ultimately foot that bill.
I think
it's called Too Late.
I think there's been a gardening accident.
Do you
Someone's pruned incorrectly.
Is that what it is?
This chap, for sure. That's Shame over there.
That's a man? It's got a moustache.
Yeah, he's got a moustache.
I didn't see that. That was Princess Leia.
I think he's trimmed the wrong rose bush.
Right, and she's pretty shocked.
She's shocked, yeah.
Yeah.
What's going to happen next? Future of work. What's the next act in this saga?
So the next act is many, many more people working in what we consider gig-style arrangements, and a layer of services that makes it easy for them to carry their CV and their reputation over from one platform to the next and one mini-employer to the next. A layer of services that allows them to get unemployment insurance and health insurance and sickness pay, maternity pay, parental leave in the same sort of way, and legislation, if required, to support that. And that will be a growing industry. It will also create much more transparency around how well people are treated and how well they do. There will also be a growth in provenance, artisanal behaviour and practices. So not quite a return to the high street, because we'll still, click and deliver from our online retailer of choice, but an increased storytelling in the kinds of products that we'll want to buy. I think we will push back quite heavily, in particular on fast fashion, which is one of the industries that's really managed to keep its head low for all of the sort of capitalist damage it does. And I'd be intrigued to see how those large firms adapt to the widening awareness of, the problems of the way in which they operate. I think we'll clearly see a significant demand for reasons of demographics over the next 10 or 15 years in the need to provide social care and how that care will end up being provided, quite likely through gig platforms. And there will still be superstars in superstar jobs getting superstar salaries, but to get into that will require a higher and higher level of capability. And so, but the main difference, I think, to be honest, in volume terms, will be the growth of this freelance economy and this idea that people will establish their own little reputation within their domain, find that work, sometimes longer contracts, sometimes shorter, be protected from the weathering of the vagaries of life, but also have to consistently, like many freelancers, whether you're a freelance designer or a freelance copywriter, take their own time in their constant ongoing training.
And if people are watching this thinking they're just a spectator in all this change, they're not in a gig work at the moment, they're not a freelancer, they're in kind of day-to-day salaried employment, what should they be aware of? And you said earlier that the future of work can be kind of controlled. Is there a role for those sorts of people? How can they help shape that future?
I think that's a fantastic question. And one of the things that I feel we didn't do, and the media didn't do over the last 15 or 20 years, was engage with the issues. People don't turn out to vote. They spend more time watching the X Factor or, Celebrity Love Brother, and I did that deliberately. I know it's called Celebrity Love Island, right? Than they do reading the things that make them useful participants in civic discourse, and then therefore participating in it and asking the right sorts of questions and applying the right kind of pressure and raising the level of discussion nationally about the issues of framing the world in which we're going to live. And I think that it's really, it's up to us in that sense, because we do have the transmission mechanisms, both through influencing our local councillor or our MP, through, frankly, even retweeting the right material, engaging in those discussions. That awareness, that prepared mind is essential if you want to even have an impact. And that, I think, is really important as we move into this moment of what I consider to be a very, very significant change that is not being driven by this exogenous shock of a hammer blow that is, say, World War II, but is being driven essentially endogenously by the economy just churning and innovating as it does consistently. And those changes are going to come rather quickly, so be well informed, therefore be opinionated, and therefore be willing to participate in the discourse.